My name is Eric Banks. I'm the director of the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. I've been excited about putting this event together for ever since I heard that Ada Calhoun was working on this project, and it's a real pleasure to welcome her tonight and Ginia Bellafante also to talk about this wonderful new book, St. Mark's is Dead: The Many Lives of America's Hippest Street, which was just published by Norton. It's really wonderful you could all join us and that you could all also join us tonight. I want to, just before we begin, thank our co-sponsor, the Center for the Humanities. We're always very happy when we can join together to bring public events to you here at NYU. I want to thank the faculty co-directors of the Center for the Humanities, Uli Baer and Jane Tylas, as well as the executive director, Gwyneth Mallon. We also want to thank Victor Batista and Danny Valentine from the Center for Humanities and Melanie Rehack from my own institute. We're really very much appreciative of everything that you do for us here. Before I'd heard of Ada's project, I had never quite thought just how much barometric value St. Mark's Place had for so many different New Yorkers and of so many different generations. I remember, for me, having one of those you will remember where you were thoughts in 1988 on the first night of the Tompkins Square riots. For me, they seemed to mark a moment that would be one of those lines in the sand in the history of East Village Bohemian life and the bigger life of New York City. You know, one of those never before, nothing will ever be the same after this moment. It will change the coolest and most alluring part of the city forever. It's almost quaint to remember that riot now, just like it's almost quaint to think about how absolutely outraged people got when the name of the Christodora house on the other side of the park came up. I doubt many people today will have even heard of the Christodora, and certainly with all the more muscular gentrification and the architecturally dubious achievements that have spread around our city for the past 3 decades, the anger around that building feels like a dusty relic of the late Koch years. At any rate, as Ada shows in her book, the history of St. Mark's is a history of many such lines in the sand. It's a story of the many different lives that St. Mark's Place has led, from poor to rich to poor again to whatever it will be in the future. Those handful of blocks can pack a real metonymic punch, too. They tell the story, the largest story of New York City, from the immigrant narrative to its long history, or the long history of Gotham as a capital of Bohemia. I was really happy to read Ada's recent op-ed piece in the New York Times titled "My City Was Gone, or Was It?" With its overtones of both Chrissie Hynde and Susie Sue, to see her talk about how a street like St. Mark's Place is always in the process of disappearing and being recreated. That's such a New York story, and her book will take its place with the great histories of New York. It's my pleasure now to welcome Ada Calhoun. She's the author, as I already told you, of St. Mark's is Dead: The Many Lives of America's Hippest Street. She has written for the New York Times, New York Post, and New York Magazine, and last week she was on the cover of the Village Voice, which called her, quote, the most important new voice on old New York. Congratulations. She grew up on St. Mark's Place herself.
Oh, boy.
Ginia Bellafante's weekly opinion column about life, politics, and policy in New York, titled The Big City, appears every Sunday in the New York Times. She has been on staff at the Times for 15 years. She has served as the paper's fashion critic and television critic, and she has written for the magazine and the book review, and in 2014 she conducted a year-long 3-part series on the place of community colleges in American education, centered on LaGuardia Community College in Queens. The series resulted in millions of dollars in donations to LaGuardia and other chronically underfunded schools from Goldman Sachs. Prior to coming to the Times, she was a cultural critic at Time Magazine. So we're very happy to welcome you both. I want to just mention briefly that we're fortunate to have some representatives of NYU Bookstore here tonight, so we hope you will avail yourself of the opportunity to purchase a copy of Ada's book and join us also afterward for the reception. We'll have a brief presentation of the book and conversation, and then we'll open it up for your questions and comments. So thank you.
So thank you so much, Eric, for inviting me to do this, and I'm so excited to be here with Ginia, who's I'm a huge fan of, and I talk about her stories every week, and I'm I love them. So I'm glad you're here. Thank you. So I thought I would just do a kind of a 400 years in 10 minutes, kind of a little introduction to the book and the idea of the book, and then we're going to talk, and then we can all talk. So basically, the op-ed that Eric mentioned said that in the course of doing the book, which took about 4 years, I interviewed maybe 250 people. And every time I talked to them, I said, what was the year that St. Mark's Place was great? When was it wonderful? And they would say, well, obviously 1988, or obviously 1975, or obviously 1964. And they always had this one year, and it was, they would swear up and down that it had been, to anybody who was sane, that was when it was great. And then the second that was over, it was dead. And since then, it's just been a steady decline into this morass of bongs and tattoo parlors, right? So anyway, and then I just started doing a little math, and I started to say, okay, well, this person says it was great in 94. This person says it was great in 44. How does that work? And I figured out that basically the year they said it was really great was the year they themselves were the hottest. And it started to make sense to me. I thought, St. Mark's Place is a street for young people, right? It's a place where you go when you're 19 and you're like, look great, and you're having fun, and you're really drunk, and it's just like this magical time for you. So the idea for the book is that it's telling those people's stories, but then also the stories of the people who are around them who are rolling their eyes, right? So it's like, when the beatniks showed up, they had a really good time. And for them, it was really, really fun. And then for all of the Ukrainians, who were there, not so much. So one story that I tell in the book is about Leshko's, which some of you might remember. It was a great diner I used to go to in high school, and it was on Avenue A. The Leshko family has lived on St. Mark's Place. They still do. They've lived there, since at least the 40s. And Stefania Leshko came home one day, and she was just like giggling maniacally. And her son said, "What is so funny?" And she was like, "Oh my God, at the diner today," she was like, "the funniest thing happened that I've ever heard." And it was one hippie at the counter turned to the other and said, "After the revolution, this will all be free." So the goal of the book is basically to show this idea of dying for you and not for other people. So I thought I would just do a quick little slideshow of periods when the street was really alive for somebody and then really dead for them. So I thought I would start right at the beginning. The Lenape people were here, right, for thousands of years. I think the Village Voice story said it was, miraculously pre-Sockman. So this is what it looked like, right? And then suddenly they're having a good time. It's a beautiful hunting ground. You have deer, you have wild turkey, you have rabbits, everything's great. And then wham, awful. It becomes one of the richest neighborhoods in all of New York. Incredibly wealthy. The Stuyvesants had hundreds of slaves. It was, a sprawling farm. And this is one of the Stuyvesant descendants. And this is actually right on St. Mark's between 1st and 2nd, which is where I grew up, but in 1800. It's pretty nice for them, right? They are strolling, they're happy. And then suddenly, wham, immigrants, right, come in, destroy their paradise. And it's pretty rough for a while. There are riots. This is, a riot from, I think it was the 1870s. You have the Depression then. Again, riots. This is right, over here at Astor Place. And then you have a little bit of order. You have Cooper Union coming in. You have this sort of push for education. You have do-gooders starting these new schools, trying to kind of civilize everybody a little bit. And that's pretty nice for a while. And then it gives birth, of course, to this huge movement toward unions. And this is Arlington Hall, which was the center of Little Germany. And this is where, right now, there's the Chipotle. But this is, this was the center of cultural life. And you had all these people coming here to meet each other and cook up plans and plot. And then not that long after this picture was taken, there was a shootout here, killing a passing civil servant. And the gangsters, they pretty much ruined things for regular people. But they had a great time. Here's one of them. This is Dopey Benny Fine. He's called this because of his sleepy eyes. And he was actually pro-union. So he only would beat up union leaders and scabs. He was very noble. And then you had, after the gangsters' day, they were sort of pushed out because they kind of got so aggressive, and there were so many violent crimes that people swept in, cleaned it up, and you had all these sort of noble folks. And one of them is this guy, Mr. Zero, who I had never heard of. I don't know if anybody knew about him before, but I came across him. He owned a ton of property on St. Mark's Place in the 20s and 30s. And he opened all of these homeless shelters. He wrote this totally insane self-published autobiography. He became Baha'i and was very mystical. And then he was also just this great showman. So he would do this, for example, he auctioned off veterans of the First World War. Because they couldn't find jobs. And to point that out, he would have them come take their shirts off in churches and things, and he would say, he fought in the blah, 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 how much do you bid? Trying to make a point, these are men who want to work, and they can't. Anyway, he thrived and thrived and thrived until he didn't, and he left $1 million in debt. His poor landlord is what, she was $1 million in debt. All right, and then, you have some sort of hardworking folks on the street. This is 34.5 St. Mark's Place, and they're pretty happy. Okay, this I wanted just to show, there's a lot of talk about new towers, right? There's some talk that there might be 2 new ones on 3rd Avenue at St. Mark's Place, and I just wanted to show, this is from 1927, and this was Frank Lloyd Wright's idea of how to develop the neighborhood. It would have happened if not for the Depression. They were trying to do it, and then they ran out of money and didn't. But I like to look at it because I like to think, what if that had happened? What if the Depression hadn't? We wouldn't be probably complaining about it now because we would be in some other stage of something. All right. So then, of course, we have this flowering, much to the chagrin of those meat market guys, of jazz clubs. And the jazz clubs become this real center for bohemian life. Beats come in, there are poetry readings, there's a lot of music. This is right around the corner, from where we are right now. The 5 spot, Thelonious Monk getting into his patroness's Bentley, I guess. And so, this is, again, great for them, right? And then you have the hippies, okay? Not as much fun for the Beats. Different scene, different interests. Jazz clubs close, and there's a liquor store, and there's a lot of hair salons, and it's wonderful for them. Here's the thing, they're right around the corner, Fillmore East, huge crowds. This is, I think, a Crosby, Stills and Nash crowd. And again, a lot of people swore up and down this was when it was good. This is the only time it was good, they say. Here's inside the Electric Circus, which is on St. Mark's Place, again, where the Chipotle is now. And then, so the hippies, started to radicalize, a lot of them. I think there might be some here tonight. So we'll hope they're feeling peaceful. So this is Jerry Rubin on the corner of St. Mark's Place and 2nd Avenue. And Gloria McDara, who's the widow of Fred McDara, who took all the great photos of the village for the Village Voice. She made available this whole series of pictures of Jerry Rubin on this day, and there is not one that anybody's paying attention to him. It's like 20 pictures of him, in quasi states of nakedness and waving, weaponry, and it's just like everybody's walking by. So I want to just talk for a second about the radicalization of St. Mark's Place and just take us up to St. Mark's Church for a second, which shows up in the book. I don't cheat very much in the book. It's almost all right on St. Mark's Place. I cheat a little bit for the Fillmore East and a little bit for St. Mark's Church, just like 2 blocks either direction for 5 minutes. And the reason for the church, obviously, is that that's where the street got its name, and it was named after it in the 1830s. And then the church has also just been kind of a real center for life in the neighborhood all the way through to today. So when the street was radicalized, some things happened. And one of my favorite stories is this is Father Michael Allen, who was the rector of St. Mark's Church. He was often called the hippie priest of St. Mark's Church. This is him performing Sam Shepard's wedding. I've read stories saying that everybody in this room was on acid. It was handed out with the programs as people walked in. And so he was a civil rights leader, and he was very much in favor of equality. I believe he marched with Martin Luther King. He fought for public education quality. And in 1969, several of the people at the church, including his secretary and his assistant rector, who he just hired, formed a group. They called themselves the Black and Brown Caucus, and they decided they would take over. His secretary, who loved Michael Allen, vowed, she was 8 months pregnant, she vowed that she would kill him if it came to it. And so one Sunday, they stood up and they walked out of church and they handed over a list of demands, and they said, we want $30,000 in cash for reparations. We want control of the vestry. We want control of the church, basically. And Michael Allen said yes, sure. Within a short time, he handed everything over to them. And his assistant rector, this guy in the white right here, took over. He married my parents in 1974. They didn't know anything about that until I did this book. They're like, oh, he seemed a little nervous, but anyway, so there I am and my mother, in order of when it happened. All right, so then I'm born, and then the punks show up. And again, great time for them, right? Hippies, they don't like it as much, right? This is not their idea of a great time. But the punks have a really good time. This is Tish and Snooki, who ran Manic Panic on St. Mark's Place for many years. They're lovely. And, hip hop, this is the Beastie Boys in front of Stromboli Pizza, which is still there. And then I feel like the sort of hardcore world, I feel like it was sort of like, beats, hippies, punks, hardcore and anarchists and all this radicalization, and then it exploded. Eric mentioned 1988 being there for the riots. This was 1991 when it was still going on. And, after the riots, to me, what it seemed like was that sort of it eradicated the alpha species of hardcore anarchists. And then it was this like flowering of all these beta species. And so I felt like when I was a teenager, it was actually kind of a magical era because you could kind of be anything, so like there were drag clubs, right? And there were skaters everywhere. And there were just like random people hanging out on stoops and, fire escapes, smoking. And there were zines and it was a kind of a magical period. Again, it was when I was at my hottest. So I think it was great. So, and now there's a whole bunch of new kids, right? A lot of them are Japanese and Korean teenagers. They line up in front of Kenka for 2 hours sometimes to get a table. The food's pretty good. I don't know if it's that good. But, there's cheap drinks, and they're having their own time. And, a lot of people have been asking me since the book came out last week, well, obviously you're not going to put up these Japanese and Korean teenagers against W.H. Auden or, it's not the same thing. Like, of course it's not the same thing. But I'd put them up against all those kids in the 60s, making out on the corner, or all the kids in the 50s at the jazz club, or all the, gangster kids running around picking people's pockets. Like, it's a place where young people are young. It always has been, pretty much, and I think it always will be. And I also think that things don't really look like anything when they're happening. That's one thing that's been consistent. This woman who lived on 2nd Avenue in St. Mark's Place told me that, she had this art student, and she saw him, and she hadn't seen him for a while, and he'd been so nice and so sweet. She saw him, like, in hot pants and tights, like, drunk on the corner of St. Mark's Place and 2nd Avenue, and she was like, oh, it's so embarrassing. I'm going to pretend I don't see him. And then, of course, it turned out that it was Arthur Killer Kane from the New York Dolls. And then she was very proud of him because he became, he was like one of the most influential musicians like ever. So to me, I think about that when I see these kids and I hear people saying, they're nothing. They can't possibly be doing anything interesting. I think nobody knew then, and I don't think anybody knows now. And I think later we'll look back and we'll know what this period of time was about. But I personally don't have the confidence to say that it's dead and over, just because it's not, it's not the skaters and the drag queens that I remember from when I was young. So that's my book in a nutshell.
Thank you, Ada. That was fantastic. And I certainly encourage everybody to read the book if you haven't already, because in addition to being this great chronicle of this very paradigmatic corner of the city, there's just an incredible historical tidbits to devour in every page. What with Hamilton fever, we should talk about Hamilton's son, to avenge his father's death, represented Aaron Burr's young
bride,
bride, who just ditched him 2 months. That was just, there's just, in addition to the wonderful history of New York, there's a lot of.
And he lived, so Hamilton's son and widow lived on St. Mark's Place at, I think, number 4. When they went up against Aaron Burr in the divorce settlement. Yes. And I think the divorce was granted the same day he died.
Amazing. Yeah. Anyway, something I have been thinking of, and I thought of it again with your great op-ed, is in the whole gentrification narrative. It's not just that we romanticize the city when we were young, but we lament and lament and lament. Every day, in the paper and a blog, there's some beloved place that closes, right? And I thought, oh my God, La Luncheonette is closed. Oh, what will I ever do? And I realized I hadn't been there in 12 years because I had a child and, moved out, didn't live in Manhattan anymore. And so we don't support these institutions, and then we are just bereft when they're gone,
right?
Which is we
want them to stay there in amber.
Exactly. And another thing I find fascinating is that we're often nostalgic. We're nostalgic for the for the city of our youth. We're also nostalgic for times we didn't live in.
Yeah,
I find a lot of people hugely nostalgic. I don't even know if that's the right word. Hugely infatuated with the New York of the 70s, and they weren't born or they didn't live here. And you saw this again, I think, in the coverage of the Eton Pates case when it was resurrected a few years ago. And editorial after editorial said, you could until then you could let your children roam free. It was such an innocent time. Well, how it was one of the most crime-ridden times in the history of New York. Why do we believe that it was, obviously it's much safer to let your children run around now,
but people don't do it now,
and people, of course, don't let their children walk 3 feet to get a quart of milk. So, that's that. I was wondering if you could talk a little about that strange compulsion to romanticize things we haven't even experienced.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely, I came across that a lot working on the book, where somebody would say, oh, when it was really good, it was like, 1980. It was just like fantastic, everything about it. If only we could go back to that time. It was so great. And I was like, I was a little girl in 1980. And like, I remember being like followed and like menaced, and you couldn't go into Tompkins Square Park. Later I had like a kid I babysat. She found like a loaded gun in a sandbox.
And you talk about kids.
It's like not that great. Right. I'm sorry. Sure, yeah, you could have gone, to Club 57 and you could have had a really fun night. But it doesn't mean that everything about it was magical and fantastic. And also in the course of doing the book, somebody sent me a VHS tape of an eyewitness news program from, I think it was 1982. And it was all about how the most famous pedophile in New York lived on St. Mark's Place.
Wow.
And I was just like, and it was like, here is his house on St. Mark's Place. And it zooms right in to the building next door to my parents. And I'm like,
great.
So I'm like, thank you. And also what drives me crazy is people would tell me that they would lecture me about how great it was in 1980. I'm going to be like, by the way, when did you move to the city? And they'd be like, 2008. Yeah. All right. So I think there's a Malcolm Cowley quote in the book in the introduction that's Bohemia is always yesterday. And I think that there is something about that where when we're living in things, like it's very hard to appreciate them and to see the beauty in them and the value. But it's much easier when you're looking back, especially if you're looking back like 30 years. I think there's this like, aura around things, from clothes from that period of time and culture from that period of time, that starts to take on this like, the same reason like we don't give our kids our parents' names, we give them our grandmother's names, because there's something about that era that's like far enough away to be cool, but also near enough, to be relevant. I don't know.
Right. And, I guess the counter argument to this, which I'm sure you're very familiar with and encountered, is, well, it was easier to live. It was just cheaper. And I'm wondering if, the argument you make in the book opens you up to criticism that this is a very conservative way to view the city. Does this mean, we should be developing all these high rises everywhere and making it impossible for, young people to come and live and pursue their creative ambitions?
Yes, I'm totally in favor of of course, like hell with them. Right. No, I think there is a real concern about whether these huge developments and everything getting so expensive is going to decrease the diversity of areas. And I think that's like a really valid question for urban planning and, rent stabilization and all this stuff. I think is it's really good that these conversations are happening, because, one thing that I love about living in a neighborhood, I live in Williamsburg, and sending my kid to public school and like being a part of this community for a long time is like, we know all our neighbors. And some of them are rich and some of them are poor, and some of them, and like, so my kid goes to school and like some of his friends' parents cut hair, and some of them are ad executives and something. And I just really like that. That's what I love about being in a city, is you have people from all different countries and they speak all different languages and they do all different things. And I think there's so much value in that. So to the extent that that's going to go away, I worry. And I don't think that's good at all. But I also think there's some sort of like entitlement, like because everything was really cheap in the 60s and 70s for this brief period in the history of New York life, it should always be like that. Or first of all, that it's possible for that to go on forever. And then that it should, I think people had to work and, have day jobs to make their art for every other generation except for this sort of blip when nobody wanted to live in the city. And so what I hear a lot, I think, is a sort of a sense of entitlement. Like, because we got to do that in 1974, everyone should always be able to do that. And that's the only way you're going to have art or culture. And I don't know, I see a lot of culture happening right now, and the kids have to work harder. They have day jobs. They have like a lot of jobs, and they live in Ridgewood, and they, but bless them. I think we should like support them and go to their shows and throw money at them, as opposed to saying like, well, it would be if you had only been here 40 years ago. And it's just, I don't know where we're going to go with that argument.
Right. And of course, as you illustrate in the book, historically, there have been many periods where poor immigrants replaced a reverse gentrification, I guess, replaced a wealthy dominant class.
Yeah. And one thing like I think I mentioned is I was having lunch with a friend of mine on St. Mark's Place, and she was like, well, rents are going to keep going up forever. I was like, that just doesn't really happen. Like, I don't think that's never happened anywhere that I know of. It's definitely not happened on St. Mark's Place. It was, it was really, really rich, and then it was really poor, and then it was really rich, and then it was really poor. And then, and I just, the idea that nothing is ever going to happen to change it. It's possible, right? We don't know. But looking at history, I don't see history stopping now.
Right. And economic cycles are what they are. There's constant flux and change. Yeah. Should we take some questions?
Oh, sure. Does anybody have questions?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I just had a couple.
Oh, a microphone.
Just a couple of questions. I live at 98 St. Mark's.
It's the cover of the book.
Lived there for a couple of years. Walk down it every day. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are as far as NYU. Does NYU have any influence on the culture of St. Mark's?
We're at NYU, right? They could turn our microphones off right now.
And also, why St. Mark's Place? Why did that street in particular? Why not 7th or 9th? What was it about that particular street that made it become what it is today? Thanks.
So of course NYU gets demonized a lot for buying up a lot of property and taking a lot over. They haven't really, I mean, I kind of limit myself to St. Mark's Place, those 3 blocks. And as far as I know, they don't own very much there, but yet. but I would say the reason I picked St. Mark's Place is it's 3 blocks. I thought it was going to be easy because I was like, oh, it's just 3 blocks. Like that's what, And then of course, 4 years later, it was a lot. So I grew up right in the middle of it. So for me, it was personal. My parents still live there in between 1st and 2nd. They're your neighbors. You should say hi. And I just like the idea that it's this sort of magical place where there's been culture coming out of it for hundreds of years, and it's a half a mile long. So I don't know another half mile in the country that's had Emma Goldman and Leon Trotsky and W.H. Auden and the Ramones and the New York Dolls and the movie Kids, and just this kind of endless cycle of interesting stuff going on. I think there's a lot of places like Haight-Ashbury, which is like for 5 minutes, that was the place. But St. Mark's Place has been that place for a lot of generations. So that's why I picked it.
Yes.
I have 2 questions. What happened to the cube? The cube?
It's in storage. The cube is in storage. It's supposed to be coming back. I've seen a rendering of it back where it belongs.
Right. And the second question is St. Mark's Place a historic district so that 1950s urban renewal ideas of destroying communities in order to create new, better, healthier, more pleasing, heavenly environments, are you worried about that?
As far as I know, only a few buildings on St. Mark's Place have been landmarked. I know there are 3 original 1830s townhouses on the street. Am I wrong?
There's a tiny historic district focused on the church itself.
On the church, yeah. So up a couple blocks, there is one.
Proposal for larger Lower East Side.
Got it. Yeah, where does that stand, his Lower East Side?
I think there's hearings coming up. It's been reviewed and whatnot. I'm not sure if it's quite in the Landmarks Commission's
right.
plot, which has a whole lot.
I see. So go to hearings. Go to the hearings if you want that landmark. But yeah, as far as I know, there's the 3, right? The original buildings, like number 4, I think, is landmarked. The Hamilton Holly house, and then a couple others. So I think it seems like there have been a few buildings that have come down and been replaced. There's one directly facing my parents' building, where like everybody's changing clothes like all the time in it. Like every time I look over there, it's like people just like changing clothes. It's all this like big glass building so you can look in. So they tore those 2 buildings down to make that one. I think one of them they just let fall down, and then the other one. But there haven't been that many like that, except for Arlington Hall, which you saw the picture of with all the union workers. And so of course that building is a building you could write a whole book about, because it was the German Center for Culture, and then it was the Polish Center for Culture, and that's where the Dom was, and Electric Circus. Andy Warhol was there with the Mod Dom. And then it was a rehab center called Allcraft in the 80s. And I really love it because a lot of the like punk rockers who went to CBGBs then got sober at Allcraft. It's like, we're already on St. Mark's Place. We're done with the drugs. Let's just stay on the street and take care of this problem. So, yeah.
Anybody else? Yes.
Did you hang in the holiday during the 90s?
Did I hang? Do you know my parents are here? I think they've heard it. Yes, I did. I did go to the holiday. That's where Adam Horovitz from the Beastie Boys, when I was talking to him about it, because they drank in the holiday even younger than I did, they were like, 14, 15, and I was like, what was the drinking age there? And he said, confidence.
Is that still around?
So the Holiday is kind of a nice, happy story because it closed
Right.
a couple of years ago, and then it reopened. Barbara Sibley, who runs La Palapa, which is a great restaurant that's been around since I was young on St. Mark's Place, she helped renovate it, and it's kind of back to its better than former glory.
Wow.
The original bar and a lot of, and she's the one who put the W.H. Auden plaque on the side, which was broken in construction, and we're actually going to replace it. Wait, anyway.
Best dive bar in the neighborhood.
It was great. You think well, it wouldn't be here at all if it wasn't for her. So maybe a shadow of its former diviness, but I like it. No, but anyway, they got good music.
This isn't a question, but you probably know that Abbie Hoffman lived at number 30, St. Mark's Place.
Yeah.
And almost next door was the St. Mark's bookstore, where his books were for sale.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote this book, Steal This Book.
Yeah.
So he went in there and stole it from me. Unfortunately, it was stolen from me later, I'm very sorry to say.
That's appropriate, though, really. Yeah, actually, there are some stories about Abbie Hoffman in the book because the Yippies did start at number 30. And I heard about some of the press conferences they would hold there. One was for a drug called lace. And they said, they called all these journalists there. They said, we've invented this drug called lace. It's great. It's an aphrodisiac. It's like DMT mixed with LSD mixed with blah, blah, blah. And they're like, and it's in these water guns. So we're going to demonstrate it, and we're going to shoot people with it, and we're going to show what's going to happen when we shoot the cops with it at the Pentagon when we levitate the Pentagon. So they took the water guns filled with lace, and they shot these, hippies just standing there in the apartment, who immediately started making out and then having sex on these mattresses in Abbie Hoffman's apartment. And Paul Grassner, the writer, told me he was supposed to be there, and that he was supposed to be one of the people who was shot with this, drug. And then he was assigned this girl to suddenly be like, oh, we have to have sex. And he said he had to have somebody replace him at the last minute, and his replacement wound up living with this redhead hippie girl forever. And then he was always jealous of them because he was like, that should have been me.
Yes.
I'd like to tell you a quick Abbie Hoffman story.
Sure.
I worked in the Strand back in the early 70s.
Wow.
And Abbie Hoffman sold a bunch of books to the old man. Benjamin Bass was still alive. It's before Fred took over the store. And he sold a copy of Steal This Book and then left. The old man opened it, and he had carved out the inside and written the word boo.
That's funny. Any other questions?
Yes.
Hi.
Somehow I think of culture in terms of St. Mark's, in terms of people like Ginsberg and the Fuggs and people of that nature. And I'm wondering where you start tracing artistic culture in terms of St. Mark's. When do you start seeing it, and where do you take it to?
Where do you start it? Well, I mean, I don't know. I think before the Fuggs, you definitely had the 5 Spot in the Jazz Gallery, and you had that whole world, and you had the Beats. I think the Fuggs, they started on St. Mark's Place. They had the Night of Napalm at the Bridge Theater at number 4, and I think that is a really early one. I don't know. I would take it through the Electric Circus and all the shows that were there, and then the through line, I guess, to all the way to Kids, the movie, and skater culture and hip hop culture. And then I feel like now there's still stuff happening at under St. Mark's, Theater 80. It's a little conservative, but there's there's still shows there.
And all this is in your book?
Yeah, it's all in my book. Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes.
You have the illustration early on of, I guess it was Stuyvesant's house from the farmers.
Yeah.
Somebody later. But I would guess that the first disruption was of the famous or infamous Manhattan grid, that the grid was immediately disrupted. No, we're not going to straighten out the streets over here. That one stays.
Yeah, exactly.
So that, I guess, sets the pace for it will always be offbeat to everything.
Right. Yeah, no, and so actually I have a map that I found on eBay, like kind of miraculously, that shows the overlay of the streets as the Stuyvesants wanted them to be. So you had like a Stuyvesant, I think it was his grandson or great-grandson, who was like, I've got it. Like, we're going to develop this. It's going to be great. We're going to name all the streets in this area after Stuyvesant family members. They're going to run due east to west and due north to south. It's going to look wonderful. All the men's names are going to go this way and all the women's names will go this way. So, like, you could live on the corner of Judith and Peter Street, or you could live on the, and it's like fabulous. So he has the whole thing. He goes, he's got the whole, and it's a really nice looking map. And then, of course, the state planners come in with the grid and they're like, yeah, no, you're not going to get to do any of this. We'll let you have Stuyvesant Street. So, and to this day, Stuyvesant Street is the one street in the area that runs due west to east, and it was the one concession. But the map, it's kind of cool to look at like what it could have been if they'd had their way.
And I wonder if Rutherford Place,
farther
maybe east, is Rutherford Stuyvesant.
I bet that could be. He was a big deal.
But one thing that I loved in the book is that Ada points out, just the creation of the grid is already the first lament. The city, it's over. The city's over. You're taking away nature.
1811.
So the very creation, conception of the city, it's done.
Yeah.
Because the grid ruins everything. It ruins the natural environment.
Yeah, exactly. No, and it's funny because I loved seeing all the different places where you'd like just read these creeds of people just being like, it's all over, it's terrible. So that was 1811 was the grid, right? That was like, New York is just never going to be any good anymore. It's just like not. And there was like a song from 1913 called New York, What's the Matter with You? And it's all about how like the lights used to burn brightly, but they just don't anymore. It's like 1913. Right.
Why don't we just say thank you, and it's been a wonderful audience, and really appreciate the conversation.